Hello, and welcome to the first of the 4 sessions, which are all about ADHD and different strategies and support that you may be able to offer your child, both non-pharmaceutical and medical as well. The final session will focus more on medication, but things will be scattered throughout around the medication side of things as well. So you will be watching these because your child or the young person that you care for has recently received a diagnosis of ADHD from our service through the Right to Choose pathway. So these sessions will hopefully give you a bit of an indication of some of the things that might be helpful to support them, also potentially just validation and reassurance of some of the things that you're already doing. But the things that I will talk about throughout the sessions are all evidence-based and based on the research and our experience, things that we know that can support young people with ADHD. So thank you for coming. The sessions are all around an hour long each. So the first session will be available and then you'll be able to click onto the next and so forth. Just an important note to say that if you have any questions whilst I'm speaking, then do just write those down. We're currently in the process of developing a frequently asked questions document. So once that's complete, that will be sent to you, and then hopefully some of those questions will be answered for you in that document. We're hoping to be rather thorough in that document and have gathered things over time. So lots of parents who have similar questions to yourselves will have probably asked those questions as well, and we'll be able to answer them as we go. Hopefully the sessions will be informative and helpful for you. So I have slides that I'm obviously sharing here, and I'll take you through those as we go for each session. So the aim of the session is, as I said, it's general and evidence-based level of knowledge about ADHD in children and young people, and general understanding of the strategies and support which are available. And as I said, these are all evidence-based and based on lots of different clinicians whom we work with who have lots of experience with ADHD and neurodivergence generally. So this first session is all about kind of generally what is ADHD, and also a bit about masking as well. So this is something that potentially your young person you have noticed is masking. It's something that can be quite common in young people, in neurodivergent people. It might be something that your young person is not feeling they have to do, or they're not struggling with, in which case that's fantastic, and you don't need to worry so much. But it's always helpful to know, just in case it gets to the point where maybe they do. So hopefully this session will be a useful starting point, and the next few sessions that we will cover will include sleep, emotion regulation and mental health, and then medication and executive functioning as well. So I will start off the sessions with just a little bit to get you kind of thinking, get you involved as best you can. So as you go, just try and think about the answers to some of these questions, and then I will reveal the answers in a few seconds so that you've got time to think about it. So the first myth busting, or true or false, is children with ADHD will always get into trouble at school. Is this true or is this false? So this is generally false. So although unfortunately children with ADHD do often get into trouble at school because of the way in which ADHD presents, so they might be inattentive, they might forget deadlines, they might lose their focus, they might be hyperactive impulsive, and so they're shouting things out, or they're needing to leave their seat, and therefore they might get into trouble. It's actually false that they will always get into trouble at school. So lots of children with ADHD will go under the radar, they'll go unnoticed because they are worried about getting into trouble or standing out. And this is partly because of that masking that I was just talking about, where children will want to fit in. So they'll try to suppress some of their ADHD behaviours and things that come with ADHD in order to try to sort of fit in, go with the grain, make sure that they don't get into trouble with teachers, and make sure they do as best they can at school. And of course, this can be really challenging for young people. ADHD is linked to neurotransmitters in the brain. True or false? So this one is true. So of course, there's real physical differences associated with ADHD, and the particular neurotransmitters that we know are strongly associated with ADHD is dopamine and norepinephrine. So these are two hormones that are produced in the brain, and I will talk a bit more about how those are linked to ADHD in a short while. Children with ADHD always face mental health difficulties, true or false? So this one is false. Unfortunately, similarly to getting in trouble at school, this can be something that lots of children with ADHD, or lots of people generally with ADHD, will struggle with. That's because I suppose managing ADHD and trying to fit in a world that's set up for neurotypicals is not an easy thing to do. Expectations are high, and sometimes there are just things that just cannot be met as a result of ADHD. So although ADHD potentially makes people more vulnerable to mental health difficulties, it doesn't have to be an inherent part of ADHD. It doesn't have to be part and parcel of ADHD. So if your young person is struggling with their mental health, this is absolutely not something that they should have to struggle with. And there is definitely support out there that they can access in order to make sure that they do thrive, so that they can do as best as possible. More people assigned male at birth have ADHD than those assigned female at birth. True or false? So this one is false. So while the diagnostic rates are still sort of more in favour of those assigned male at birth, so boys and men, generally we know that actually it's not more common in men and boys. It's just that we're more likely to recognise it and assess and diagnose it in men. So this is still unclear because of missed and misdiagnosis, perhaps in the female presentation, but we're actually beginning to learn a lot more about how ADHD can present in a female presentation as well, and how these might present differently between the genders. So that gap is closing between the diagnosis rate between males and females, but generally it's not more common in males. It's just as common in females. It's just potentially under-recognised. ADHD could not be diagnosed alongside autism until 2013. True or false? So this one is true. So until 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual didn't allow both autism and ADHD to be diagnosed together. So if a person had a diagnosis already of autism, they were not able to also receive a diagnosis of ADHD and vice versa. This to me is absolutely wild, because of course we now know, given all of the research, that ADHD and autism can very, very commonly co-occur, and they do overlap as well. So fortunately now we're able to diagnose both in one person, and that helps the person to understand themselves a bit better than just sort of labelling and putting everything down to just one of those diagnoses. How ADHD presents can differ at different stages of the menstrual cycle. True or false? This one is true. So estrogen, of course, is part of the female hormones that we have, and it has a really important role in regulating the neurotransmitters. So at certain phases of the menstrual cycle, estrogen will decrease, and at the same time that estrogen decreases, so does dopamine, and that was one of the key neurotransmitters that I said is involved with ADHD. So when estrogen is kind of peaking and troughing, so will dopamine, and that will affect how ADHD might present itself in females. And I think I will talk about that a bit more in session 4, the medication session. I think this is my last one for the myths. ADHD was first documented around 100 years ago. Is this true or false? So this one's false, although it was a bit of a trick one. So although presentations of ADHD became more frequently reported around 100 years ago in formal documentation, there are actually accounts of ADHD presentations dating back to textbooks dating back to 1775. Why might this be? Because ADHD is not a new thing. It's not something that's suddenly appearing more and more. Actually, it has existed, for a very, very long time. It's just that now we're recognizing it more so. So that might be why there are higher diagnostic rates. because we're able to recognize it, assess for it, and diagnose it. Whereas I'm sure we can kind of all think of potential people in older generations maybe who have missed diagnosis because it just wasn't as commonly considered quite only a few years ago. So just an important note to say, of course, I've been talking about neurodivergence and neurodivergent people. So what I will talk about is neurodiversity is the kind of the umbrella term for everyone. So everyone in the world is neurodiverse. Together collectively, we are neurodiverse. And within that, there are different types of people. So there are neurodivergent people, such as those with ADHD, autistic people, dyslexic people, people with developmental coordination disorder, or dyspraxia, as we also know it as. And then there are also neurotypical people, so people whose brains don't work in the same way that a neurodivergent person's brain works. So no one person can be neurodiverse. One person is neurodivergent, and that's why that's the terminology that I'll use. You might also notice that I'm referring to autistic people rather than a person with autism. Generally, it's down to personal preference, but what is evident is that most of the time people like identity first language. So I am an autistic person rather than a person with autism. And of course, it's important just to note on the slide here that ADHD is the most commonly diagnosed neurodivergent condition in childhood. So it's more commonly diagnosed than things like autism or dyslexia. And again, that just goes to show how much more we're recognizing it today. So a note on the brain function, if I can speak, and structure. This is an important thing to note because it's important that ADHD is known that it has real physical differences in the brain. So the way in which the brain is developed, the way in which it works is different in an ADHD brain or a neurodivergent brain versus a neurotypical brain. So it's not just something that's maybe behavioral that some people will say. It's not a choice. Actually, there are real physical differences going on. So as you can see here that you've got the different parts of the brain. So we've got the frontal lobe here. I believe you can see me circling around here. And then at the very front part of the frontal lobe is what we call the prefrontal cortex. So we know that this part of the brain plays an important role in concentration, emotion regulation, decision making. Some of you might recognize that your child has problems with kind of decision paralysis, not being able to weigh up what they might want to do. This is because that frontal part of the brain is different in an ADHD child or someone with ADHD versus a neurotypical brain. So we know that there's some delay in the development of the prefrontal cortex, and also there's reduced activity in that part of the brain in those with ADHD. So generally, that part of the brain for anyone, for neurotypicals and neurodivergent people, is developing until around the until you're around mid-20s. So children are generally developing this part of their brain anyway. For an ADHDer, you have kind of double whammy, as they are still also developing this part of their brain, and there's real kind of structural functional differences in this part, and that's why things are then potentially more difficult for them. Again, as I noted, the real physical differences and the role of these neurotransmitters, the hormones in our brain. So most importantly, the ones we associate with ADHD are dopamine and norepinephrine. So dopamine you've probably come across before. It's that kind of reward system that we have in our brain. It's what is released when we're kind of enjoying something, when we are on track with something, when something is kind of pleasurable. Dopamine is released, it kind of floods through the brain, and it kind of allows us to stay on track with things. In ADHDers, dopamine levels are lower. This is because the brain doesn't produce as much dopamine, but also because the receptors in the brain, as you can see in this diagram here, do not pick up as much dopamine as they might do for a neurotypical. So that means that their ability to kind of focus on things, to stay on track with things, is evidently more difficult. Same for norepinephrine. So this hormone or neurotransmitter is associated with kind of our fight or flight response. So it's all about our attentional ability. So how much we're able to attend to what's going on around us. So in the fight or flight, it would be making sure that we're aware enough to pick up any kind of threats or risks around us. When we need to, norepinephrine is increased in the brain so that we can respond to what's going on around us. Again, as you might have guessed, in ADHD, norepinephrine is reduced. It's not as a high level as neurotypicals might have. So therefore, they're kind of having to work overtime in order to attend to what's going on around them. And this also, of course, influences both dopamine and norepinephrine influence hyperactivity and impulsivity levels as well. We also know that when these neurotransmitters are lower, this is associated with low mood and depression as well. So sometimes, again, that might be another vulnerability that someone with ADHD might have to low mood. But again, like I said, it doesn't have to be part of that presentation. So it can be resolved. I'll definitely refer to these hormones kind of throughout the sessions as they're really important, but particularly in the medication session as well, that final session 4. So what are the causes of ADHD? So research has shown that ADHD might be caused, or the likelihood of ADHD might be increased by a different number of things. That may is kind of in italics there because actually it's really unclear, it's uncertain about what might cause ADHD. So some of the things that the research has indicated is brain anatomy and function, of course, as we've talked about, those kind of differences in the structure and the function of the brain. Genes and heredity as well. So we know that from the research, a child who has ADHD has a 1 in 4 chance of also having a parent who has ADHD. So sometimes what we find at Health Psychology is when we are giving a child their feedback, their diagnosis, a parent might begin to wonder or question whether they too should go and seek an assessment because they start to think, I see similarities and potentially I might also have ADHD. Or also often the parent already has that diagnosis of ADHD or someone close within the family as well. In some cases, significant head injuries, particularly early on in childhood, can cause ADHD, again, because of those differences in the structure of the brain. Epilepsy, we know, really commonly co-occurs with ADHD. And premature birth as well. So children who are born prematurely are more likely to have ADHD than those who are born kind of full term. And then some prenatal exposures like drugs, alcohol, smoking, particular substances can make it more likely for a child to develop ADHD. So for example, if a mother is using cannabis during her pregnancy, we know that this is likely to contribute to the likelihood of that child developing ADHD. Of course, there's no single risk factor as such, and I don't like this wording risk factor because ADHD should be seen as something that's necessarily a risk or something negative, something that we shouldn't have or we should be trying to get rid of. But there's no single thing that's necessarily causing ADHD. Like I said, we don't understand it completely, but we know that it's often a combination of these things. So how common is ADHD in the population? So recent research shows that it's around 6 to 10 children and adolescents have ADHD kind of globally. I imagine that this number is likely to increase, like I said, as we're beginning to recognise it more and more, and we're beginning to recognise the differences in the presentation. So previously we might have thought it was very strictly just to do with kind of a very fidgety, active child, and actually we're learning so much more about how ADHD can present in terms of how someone kind of thinks about themselves, their self-esteem, their mental health, how they approach different tasks, how they think about things. So we're learning so much more about it now. The prevalence of ADHD decreases as children get older. What this means is that it's not that ADHD kind of disappears as children get older. It's that it's less less observed, so we're less likely to see an obvious ADHD presentation in a teenager, in someone in their mid-20s, and so on into adulthood. And that's usually because of that development of the prefrontal cortex, the development of management strategies, and kind of being able to to manage and cope better day to day with the demands of the day to day, and also sometimes because of that masking as well, and when people don't even recognize that they might be masking because they've been doing it for so long. And as I said earlier, research shows that more commonly we're diagnosing those assigned male at birth than those assigned female at birth, at a rate of around 3 to 1. Just a note then on the differences in the presentations. So these are kind of ideas about how ADHD might present differently in boys versus girls, but not always. You know, it's really important not to stick too rigidly to this, because we know that there's definitely crossover, there's definitely overlap, and it's important just to get an idea of how they might present in different ways. So generally, the thinking is that boys might show externalized signs of hyperactivity and impulsivity, whereas girls show internal signs of inattention, things like daydreaming, low self-esteem. As I said, not always. Of course, you're going to come across girls who are very hyperactive, very impulsive. You're going to come across boys who are very kind of reserved, very maybe inattentive, keeping themselves to themselves, and this can kind of be internalized and impact on self-esteem. Again, research is suggesting that boys are maybe likely to show outward signs of frustration when they have ADHD, whereas girls are more likely to internalize frustrations. And girls may be more likely to or better at masking than boys. This thinking comes from kind of cultural and social expectations on girls. But actually what we know is that boys will also mask, and boys can also be very competent at masking and very effective at masking as well. So again, it's important not to hold these ideas too tightly, but it's just some of the ideas about the differences in the presentations. So thinking about executive functioning, which I'll cover again in more detail in session 4, but executive functioning is the process which that prefrontal cortex part of our brain is sort of in charge of. So it's almost like the chief executive in the brain. It's trying to allow us to do all the things like planning what we need to do, prioritizing our time, problem solving, flexible thinking, decision making. It helps us to control our emotions, impulses. And what we know is, let me skip the slide so you can see all of those different things. And what we know is that in ADHD, executive functioning is affected. It is harder for someone with ADHD to manage those executive functions. So the chief executive is almost having to work harder to do some of those things. And that's why we kind of see the ADHD presentation that we do. So of course, staying on task, initiating tasks, being able to stick with things, being able to control impulses, make decisions, planning and prioritizing time, all of those things, you know, are really frequent, and it sounds like I'm describing an ADHD, and they are executive functions. So we know that these things are affected in ADHD. So it's really important that we're kind of mindful of this, and also that we think about potentially some strategies that can be put in place to help support your young person with ADHD, so that they can better manage those executive functions and kind of thrive in day-to-day life, because it is such a demand. It's something that we need to be kind of using in the day-to-day, particularly, you know, whilst young people are at school. All of these things are necessary, and there's a lot of demand on young people, you know, for homework, assignments, exams, all sorts, and that's just in that academic aspect. Of course, all of these things are potentially necessary in the social aspect of life as well, or the emotional aspect as well. So it comes into play in all the different elements. So it's a really important thing to be holding in mind. Thinking about ADHD, which is this kind of colloquial term that we've given to someone who has received a diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. So ADHD is not a formal diagnosis as such, but it's just a way of kind of thinking about that presentation when someone is both autistic and ADHD. And quite often it can be thought of that the two will clash with one another, that autism will pull someone in one direction and ADHD will pull someone in another. And then, of course, when that's in one person, that can be really difficult to manage. So I thought it would be important or helpful to just consider how ADHD might present itself. So to begin with, here, there's sensory sensitivities quite often in autism. So generally in ADHD, we see sensory processing differences. So autism might pull towards sensory sensitivities, so being more overly impacted by loud environments, bright environments, kind of the overwhelming sense of smells that are maybe not something that other people have picked up on, or people being too close, all of these things, sensory sensitivities. There may also be sensory seeking behaviors in autism as well, so seeking out certain feelings of things. And in ADHD as well, there's often kind of that sensory seeking as well, or that need for stimulation, and this comes from that need to kind of boost that dopamine, so needing that stimulation. So sometimes the two can work really nicely together, and sometimes they can butt heads a little bit. Comforting special interests with a need to switch tasks. So ADHDers will generally tend to have kind of fixed interests, things that they like, things that they enjoy, things that they can hyper focus on. But then ADHD might mean that they will want to switch tasks quite frequently as well. So to keep that attention going, to kind of optimize that attention span time and to boost that dopamine again. They might prefer a strict routine, but then struggle sticking with it. Similarly, need to have organized plans, but a difficulty following through with it. So again, autism, we know there's kind of this need for sameness, seeking out of routine and consistency. And then ADHD actually prefers this more spontaneous excitement, kind of doing new things. And again, that's where the two can clash. Of course, I'm talking about this very generally and I suppose stereotypically, so it might be that it doesn't necessarily present in this way, but generally this is the thinking. And as a result of all of these things, of course, it's easy to become easily overwhelmed and overstimulated. When someone is autistic, they might have sensory sensitivities, as I said, and if they have ADHD, they might really struggle to focus on just one thing at a time. So if you're in a busy environment and you have a child who's ADHD, they might be getting overwhelmed by the sounds, by the people, by the busyness. And then if they also, the ADHD side of it will be potentially tuning into different conversations, different things happening around. It's just overstimulation. So it can result in really easy overwhelm. And this can sometimes mean that there are intense emotional reactions. So things like meltdowns or shutdowns, which I'll talk about more in session 3, just because things can become really overwhelming. Of course, ADHDers can be very creative as well. So we know that one of the wonderful things about neurodivergent people is that they think differently from neurotypical people. So they will kind of think outside the box about things. They'll come up with strategies for things that others might not have thought of. They might, look at something and find a real shortcut to it, or a completely different way of thinking that's much, much better than has already been considered. There can be social misunderstandings and relationship difficulties, again, because we know that autistic people might sometimes struggle to pick up on certain social cues. What should I say? What should I do? When should I join in? Similarly, in ADHD, there might be the impulsivity, so not knowing when to join in or kind of interrupting, blurting out, and that kind of impulsivity can cause some social misunderstandings and relationship difficulties. Of course, when you have the two together, this can be really, really difficult for ADHDers and can really impact that sense of self and that self-esteem. And then finally, of course, an ADHDer will often attempt to mask all of these difficulties in an attempt to kind of appear like they're able to fit in, like there's not kind of this internal struggle going on. So, of course, I've mentioned a lot of the really difficult things. There are, of course, lots of really lovely positive things as well about ADHD, but it's just helpful to be mindful of if you do have a child who has received both the diagnosis of autism and ADHD. So I just wanted to note as well that if you don't have a child who's been diagnosed with both, but you were listening to that thinking, well, this does sound like my child, if they've just got the diagnosis of ADHD, I just wanted to note that actually because they do overlap, they do look similar in, sometimes. It doesn't mean to say that your child is also autistic. It might be that some of those things can just be accounted for because of ADHD. So, for example, that sensory seeking that you see in autism might actually just be ADHD, and it's that seeking out of high stimulus, like I said, trying to seek out something to boost that dopamine. They might have phases of interests as well, which we know sometimes looks like autism. But like I said, that's that kind of switching between being hyper-focused on something and then moving on from it and going to something else which boosts that dopamine and keeps that interest and that attention going. Of course, an ADHD will also mask. They will do certain things to try to fit in, to look like others in order to get by kind of socially, academically, generally. There might be intense emotional reactions, and this is a key part potentially of a child who has ADHD, and it is why I have a whole session talking about this in session 3. Of course, feeling easily overwhelmed and overstimulated, as I said, sort of tuning into lots of different things. Also, just the demands of day-to-day life are really hard on an ADHD, so it is easy for them to kind of feel weighed down with what's going on. But of course, ADHDers can be very creative and imaginative. As I said, they might think about things differently. An ADHDer generally will try to think about how they can get something done as best they can in a quick way, so that they can kind of keep their attention on the thing that they're enjoying, that they like doing. So if they're hyper focused on something, then that's fantastic and they can produce really amazing results. If they're not so interested in something, they'll probably try to do it and find a good way to get it done so that they don't have to spend so much time on it because it's not all that interesting. So there's lots of creativity and imagination in ADHD as well. So thinking about masking, as I said, and this kind of phrase that we use, dropping the mask. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of how this might be done. Of course, dropping the mask is so much easier said than done. And that's because, unfortunately, masking can just become part of day-to-day life for someone who has ADHD. So masking can be done kind of intentionally, consciously, or unintentionally, because it just feels like it's maybe the right thing to do, or because of external pressures, or because someone has been masking for so long that they don't realize that that is something that they are still doing kind of day to day. So an ADHD might mask by trying to suppress kind of hyperactivity. They might stop themselves from fidgeting. They might kind of put their hands underneath themselves to stop themselves from picking things up, fiddling with things. They might stop themselves from getting up, moving around, or they might do something like making a conscious effort, telling themselves over and over again, you know, pay attention to what this person's saying, make sure you look like you're interested, make sure that you look like you're following, rather than kind of actually what can happen is obviously attention might drift in ADHD. So there's real conscious effort that is going into this, or like I said, of course, unintentional as well, because it's just something that someone's doing, they don't realize they're doing. In both unintentional and intentional masking, this, of course, can negatively impact mental health, self-esteem, and lead to burnout over time as well. Like I said, this is something that's going to be really draining and really exhausting for a young person, for anybody who is masking neurodivergence. So the idea of dropping that mask, of being able to be their authentic selves, is so important, and is something that really does take time. It's really a case of building that confidence over time, becoming more, boosting that self-esteem, becoming happy and confident with the person that they are. Of course, like I said, it's so much easier said than done. It might take a long time to undo some of the tendencies of masking, and it might take a long time for someone's confidence to be boosted if they have felt that their self-esteem has been suppressed because of things that have happened to them. So, of course, like we say, encourage the young person to be themselves, to be their authentic self. And lots of people will say, you know, to their child, be yourself, and those who are meant to be kind of in your circle, those who are meant to be involved in your life, will gravitate towards you, and those who are not, and those who don't accept you for who you are, will not be in your circle, and that's fine, because you don't need those people in your life anyway. So of course that's a really important thing to think about, and it's a really lovely idea of how we can think about how to accept ourselves and be more authentic about ourselves. But there's also this idea of actually young people, and generally people with ADHD, thinking that, but actually sometimes those in my circle, those who I do want there because I really do care about them, I really do value them, sometimes I say or do things that actually I don't like as a result of my ADHD. So I might interrupt them all the time, or I might lose focus, and then I haven't been listening to what they've been saying. And it's really important for me that I do listen to them, because I care, and because I want to be able to help them or support them, or be excited for them. You know, I want to be attending to what they're saying, or I don't want to be interrupting, those kinds of things. They might say, actually, this doesn't align with who I want to be. So it's all well and good saying, drop the mask, be who you are, just let yourself sort of be as the ADHD might be. But sometimes that can be really difficult as well. So I've put here 2 links to a blog that's really, really helpful, and talks about this idea of, if this is the case, it talks about compassionate self-monitoring as opposed to harsh self-criticism when someone is masking. So the motivations are different between these 2 things. So it's about someone recognizing, about helping your child to recognize what is the kind of person that they want to be in friendships, what is the kind of person that they want to be academically, you know, within the family, where at home, emotionally, how do they want to be, what's important to them, and kind of helping them to think about what their values are. And then once you've got that, helping them to kind of lead this life in line with those values. So compassionate self-monitoring, checking in with themselves compassionately, kindly, saying, am I being how I want to be in this moment? Or did I word that quite right? And if I didn't, then I'll go to that friend and I'll say, and I'll kind of repair whatever might have happened. And that might help them to feel like they're more aligned with their values and the person they want to be, whilst also helping them to drop the mask and do that in a compassionate and kind way. Of course, the other thing that's important to be mindful of in this kind of skill is that there has to be this level of awareness of what's going on. So if the mind is being very harsh, very self-critical, saying, you know, you shouldn't have done that, that was really bad, you're awful, you're an awful friend, that's more harsh self-criticism. And like I said, the motivations of wanting to change or repair something is different in compassionate self-monitoring versus harsh self-criticism. So if someone is doing something because they feel bad about themselves, because they hate the way that they were, or because they didn't like what happened, that's probably more likely self-criticism. Whereas if someone's thinking, actually, I'm doing this because I really want to be this good friend, because I really care, because I value this friendship. I realize I'm using friendship a lot as an example, but hopefully this is kind of ringing true. Then they can use that to help them to be more compassionate and self-monitor. So it's this idea of building that awareness, building kind of mindfulness, making sure they're checking in with what they're thinking and what they're feeling, so that they can notice when their mind might be slipping into that harsh self-criticism versus the compassionate self-monitoring. And just a note as well on kind of compassion and self-compassion is that I know often psychologists will talk about this a lot, and they will say, you know, self-compassion is really important, and it really is. And I think a lot of people, potentially self-compassion gets a bad rep, and people think that it's a bit wishy-washy, it's just kind of letting ourselves off the hook, and actually it's really not. And it takes a lot of skill and a lot of strength to be compassionate towards ourselves, because it's not something I think that naturally comes to us. So I always like to use the example of kind of firefighters, in that they are showing some form of compassion when they run into a burning building, for example, to save the people inside of that burning building. You know, there is compassion there for getting those people out, for getting them out safely. Of course, running into a burning building is not a wishy-washy thing to do. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage. So sometimes, if you're trying to get your child on board with self-compassion, that example can be a really nice one and a really powerful one, because it shows that actually it's something that it's not just letting yourself off the hook, for example. It's just being kinder to ourselves, to allow ourselves to thrive, to drop the mask, to be who we want to be overall. So how to do some of these things, so how to kind of maybe boost self-esteem. So thinking about maybe clubs and activities for other neurodivergent children, things that they can get involved with where they can meet other ADHDers, so that they can feel like, they're part of a community, that they can meet people who are similar to them, meet like-minded people. That will help to boost self-esteem and let them feel more confident in who they are. Like I said, encouraging self-compassion to reduce those harsh and self-critical thoughts. And this is something that will help us to become more mindful of recognizing those harsh and self-critical thoughts as well. You can gently challenge any critical thoughts for them as well. So if you notice that your child is kind of coming home from school saying, I'm absolutely rubbish, I always get things wrong, I always get in trouble, you can maybe gently challenge that kind of critical thought by questioning it a little bit. Well, is it the case that you're always getting things wrong? Because I think actually you did a piece of homework the other week that was fantastic, or whatever it is that helps the young person to start to gently think about whether or not their mind is kind of telling them whole truths or thoughts that are helpful in that moment. So encouraging them to kind of gently challenge any of those critical thoughts. Like I said, consolidating their values and qualities, sitting with them, getting them to think about what you really value in them, what you think are their qualities, their skills, their strengths, and then over time helping them to get to see those things in themselves as well, so that they can start to think, okay, what are the things that are really important to me? What are the things I'm good at? How can I work to those strengths? How can I use those to my advantage? Exploring role models. So there's lots of inspirational people who have ADHD as well, and I think I talk about those a bit more on the next slide. So lots of kind of Olympians, musicians, entrepreneurs, actors. There's lots of role models who have ADHD. So if someone's feeling particularly low in their sort of self-esteem or struggling to come to terms with the diagnosis, then this might be a helpful way to boost that self-esteem. Model authenticity yourself as well. So if this is something, you might be thinking, oh, this rings true for me as well, that I maybe need to be more compassionate to myself. Modeling authenticity can really, really help for your young person to see that, you're not perfect either. No one needs a perfect parent. They need a parent who, will show when they've maybe got things wrong, or they'll make a joke about something that they've done, or something they haven't got quite right. I try my best to model authenticity in these sessions as well. I will stumble over my words, I will get things mixed up and wrong. That's just part of being human. No human is perfect, and then we have to kind of own that and model that authenticity, so that our children can also grow up not feeling like they are so set in this need to be perfect, this need to perform, which of course is why people generally tend to mask, because they're performing to meet the expectations of what's going around them externally. Reinforce positive ideas and opinions that they have, just to boost that self-esteem, that confidence, and to feed into that gentle challenging of self-critical thoughts, that actually they do have real positive qualities. They've got good ideas, they've got good opinions about things. So when they do that, name that explicitly and help them to see those things. And then these three people are just kind of champions of self-compassion. So Brene Brown, Paul Gilbert, and Kristin Neff are all people who have websites, books, webinars, podcasts, all about self-compassion. And I've put Kristin Neff's website there as well. Just there's lots of different activities or ideas and things about how you might like to help to boost self-esteem and self-compassion in your young person. And then some other helpful resources that you might like here is the self-compassion workbook for teens, or the self-compassion workbook for kids as well. So I'll leave those links for just a moment in case you want to click on those. Like I said earlier, we spend a lot of time thinking about the things that are difficult and the things that are challenging in ADHD. And I suppose that's kind of generally because we're thinking about the strategies in order to help support our children with ADHD. But it's also really important to think about the positives of ADHD as well. So that ability to hyperfocus, as I said, that can be fantastic. It can produce amazing results when an ADHDer is able to fix in on something. They can really give it their best. They can think about things in detail that we never even thought to go into. So that ability to hyperfocus can sometimes be a huge blessing and a real positive quality. ADHDers generally are quite curious people, and that curiosity allows them to think a bit about things a bit more. They'll question things, they'll ask questions that we might not have thought about, and they just help to get everybody thinking. Then that's why there's lots of entrepreneurs who have ADHD, because they're thinking, well, actually, why are we doing it that way, or why can't we do it this way? Or they're thinking about things in order to try to kind of anticipate what might happen, or they're just generally curious about different things, which is lovely. As I've already mentioned, creative as well, thinking outside the box, thinking about ways to do things that others might not have already done. Quick wit and humour as well. So I always use the example that, you know, I do work with lots of ADHDers, and sometimes we'll be in a meeting and everyone's thinking something and the ADHD will be the one to say it, and you just think, thank goodness someone said it. And it's a really lovely, authentic thing, and they can be very quick-witted, very humorous about things. So that's a real positive quality and a strength to reflect back to your child with ADHD. Determination as well. I think some ADHDers, sometimes people think that they kind of lose focus and give up on things and don't see things through to the end. But actually, the flip side of that is that they are some of the most determined people in the world as well. If they've got their mind set on something, there is no way that they are being kind of distracted or deviated from that. That is what they're going to do. So they can be very determined as well. As I said, there's lots of positive role models out there who have ADHD. So ADHD, I guess what I'm trying to say, is not something that should hold your child back in life. That there's lots of positive qualities about ADHD as well. And it's about thinking about what we can put in place in order to manage some of the more difficult sides of ADHD, so that these positive sides can kind of glow as they want to. And some famous examples there. So Paloma Faith, Stephen Fry, Justin Timberlake, Millie McIntosh, will.i.am, Emma Watson, Jamie Oliver, Michael Phelps. Of course, there's loads and loads out there, but just maybe a few examples that might be nice to share with your child. And a final note on ADHD superpowers. So this is something that I just wanted to acknowledge, because some people, as I've been talking about the positives, will refer to ADHD as a superpower, and they'll say, you know, ADHD is fantastic, it's your superpower, it's what makes you you. And of course, this is true to some extent, and it really helps to empower people and make them feel positive and accept that the diagnosis is part of them. And that's really great. But the other side of that is that sometimes I've heard that people say that this can be really invalidating for someone with ADHD, because they say, but actually it does bring extra struggle to my day-to-day life. It does mean that I have to work that bit harder than a neurotypical might. You know, if I use the example of children going into their GCSE exams, an ADHDer is likely going to have to work harder to get the same as a neurotypical. So that's why it's really helpful to put things in place like additional time if it's helpful, or reduced environments, or breaks throughout exams, as an example. So just to kind of acknowledge this difference between the perspective on calling ADHD a superpower, and it will be completely up to your young person and you, whether you refer to it as that, whether it changes over time or depending on what's going on. But I just wanted to acknowledge that it can be seen in more than one way. So that brings me to the end of session 1. Hopefully it's been a useful overview of ADHD generally, some ideas about things that you maybe hadn't thought of or you didn't know before. Maybe also, like I said at the start, it's just reassuring to know that you're already doing some of these things, some of these evidence-based strategies, like with the masking and the boosting self-esteem, and hopefully it's given you a bit of a background. Like I said, if you've got questions that you've written down, hopefully if you refer to our frequently asked questions document, these will be answered within here. And of course, there are 3 more sessions to go as well. So some of those questions might be answered in later sessions as well. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next session, which is all about sleep.